Welcome to CNN Talk. Welcome to our viewers on Facebook. We're discussing a CNN exclusive today. It relates to Saudi Arabia and the recent executions. And as we understand it, the confessions, for at least some of them, were forced. Arwa's done the reporting on this. Just give us the headline, shock finding you've discovered, Arwa.
Well, Max, these documents were actually obtained by CNN's Tamara Kablawi and poring over them for hours along with Ghazi Balkis. And what seems to be a trend that we have found is that in some of these so-called confessions, the defendant then in court tells the judge that that confession was obtained under torture, or that they signed a document not knowing what was actually in it because they were being tortured and then threatened with even more torture. And what we don't know, and what isn't clear from the documents, is whether or not those allegations were actually ever then investigated by the court.
Okay, let us know what you think. Obviously, you'll have your views about Saudi Arabia and what's sort of been revealed here. What was your initial response, Bonnie?
Well, we are in a world right now, and Andrew and I talked about this, where we are not interested in internationalism. We have no world leaders. We don't want them, actually. We want to stay local. So we have this actually renegade government, which is part of a proxy war and a triangle of terror, actually, in the Middle East. And what are we going to do about it? We don't want to do anything about it. I mean, to be honest, we can have feelings about it, sentiment about it, which we do. But we're demonstrating in our electorates that we don't want to deal outside of our own purview.
It is the point, isn't it? I mean, we can have this reporting and this knowledge, but what is the response going to be, actually?
Well, exactly, especially when the Saudis are wheeling things around like $100 billion investment funds, listing of things like Saudi Aramco on stock exchanges. This is all big money, big business that Western businesses that in Western countries that are struggling for growth want in their country. So the moral leadership that we were discussing, the lack of moral leadership, isn't being helped by the economic imperative. And that's always been the case with Saudi Arabia and odious regimes around the world. You did your dirty bit of business while making maybe a verbal protest. But to actually get the change you need to see in Saudi Arabia, we're going to need a step change. And that leadership used to come from places like the United States and countries like Canada and countries like the United Kingdom. But nobody seems willing to pipe up either to do things like cancel military contracts, cancel economic ties. You saw HSBC's chief went down for a conference the day after they executed all these people as a giant middle finger to the world after they canceled a similar conference or had a reduced attendance at a conference when Jamal Khashoggi was dismembered and murdered by the Saudi government.
Most of the executed were from the Shia minority in the country. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't. And I think we have to be really, really clear-eyed about just the escalation of kind of barbarism. Reprieve is a big charity which campaigns against the death penalty. They say that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has executed more than 100 people in the first 4 months of 2019, and it's on track to execute 300 more this year. Yet, as Andrew said, as Bonnie said, our government leaders refuse to condemn. They do the warm words about how they really, Saudi Arabia needs to step up its human rights. We still call Saudi Arabia an ally. We on this show, celebrated the fact that they let women drive cars, which was an absolute hoodwink to put, kind of fake the world that somehow Saudi Arabia was moving on. Yet we now find a lot of those feminist activists are being tortured and executed in prison right now. And I'm afraid at some point, a tipping point, I understand that the military contacts, I understand the oil, I understand the economics, but as Western democracies who pride ourselves on our values, we've got to start speaking up for this stuff.
Lorraine on Facebook says, what can you say? The world's governments love the Saudis regardless. Isabel says, Saudi ratified the UN Convention Against Torture, shows why such international agreements are utterly meaningless.
Well, that's the problem.
Let us know what you think on our Facebook feed. We're coming to the TV show in just a couple of moments. Today we're talking about the CNN exclusive report. We're learning more about one of the largest mass executions in Saudi Arabia's history. Some of the men executed on Tuesday had claimed their confessions were forced. CNN has obtained hundreds of pages of documents about their trials. Take a look.
On Tuesday, Saudi Arabia announced that it executed 37 people convicted of terror-related crimes. It was one of the largest mass executions in the kingdom's history.
The UN human rights chief is condemning mass executions carried out across Saudi Arabia, citing grave concerns that the 37 men put to death did not receive fair trials.
The court documents themselves show that a number of those accused, while in court, told the judge that their confessions were extracted under torture. The vast majority of these men were members of Saudi Arabia's Shia minority. The families weren't notified ahead of time, at least not according to Amnesty International, so they weren't even able to say goodbye to their loved ones.
Have your say on our Facebook feed. Judy says, it's none of our business. Heidi says, the Saudis have a terrible human rights record. And Tim says, the Saudi leadership disregards human rights, yet they are still America's ally. We welcome our viewers and our listeners also on the podcast. Go to Apple Podcasts, look up CNN Talk. Arwa has been doing this reporting for us. Arwa, we heard some of the highlights of your reporting there, but just take us through what they were charged with and why you think those confessions were forced.
Well, first of all, Max, there's actually a number of different cases whose court documents CNN's Tamara Kablawi exclusively managed to obtain, and her and our producer Ghazi Balkis have been pouring through all of these pages. And these court documents go to a couple of different cases. One is this Iran spy case, and the other one is the Awamiya 24. The Awamiya 24, that is reference to the demonstrations, anti-government demonstrations that were happening in the city of Awamiya, predominantly Shia, people there calling for freedom, for democracy, for better basic services and the like. When you look at the, especially Awamiya case, if we take that as an example, the prosecutors and these documents seem to be trying to paint this picture of the accused of being violent, of talking out, demonstrating against the government. Some of them are also accused of homosexual activity. But what is especially revealing in these documents is that a number of them say that their confessions were obtained under torture. And you have one of the men, for example, and if I just read from that, who's 27 years old, and he is partially blind, partially deaf. He says that he signed this document because he didn't know what was going on. He says, those aren't my words. He said this actually in court. He says, I didn't write this letter. This is defamation written by the interrogator in his own hand. And that's just one example of the many that our team uncovered going through all of these documents. Another big issue in all of this is that in 2017, the United Nations was actually investigating, looking into Saudi Arabia's human rights violations, and they had asked the Saudi government specifically about this case. And the Saudi government made it seem like it was a done deal, that these individuals had confessed and that the convictions stood up in trial. Well, what these court documents actually show is that in court, they said that their confession was extracted under duress, and we don't have reaction. We don't have a response from the Saudi government as to whether or not those claims to torture were ever actually investigated.
Aisha, if we summarize the findings as we've seen them, these admissions were written by torturers. Most of the executed were from the Shia minority. 3 were minors at the time of the alleged crimes, and one man's body was crucified after execution, so his body was displayed. I mean, it's all true, according to these documents. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's chilling, it's medieval, it's barbaric. We talk about the death cult of ISIS, but actually the type of, execution we're seeing here, I think is no different. I have had some information from a British charity, Reprieve, which campaigns against the death penalty. It's a charity that I support. And actually, I'm not surprised by what the CNN investigation has found. I think there has been very little due process. As you say, many of these are minors, but also the true crime of many of these people was nothing more than sharing information about peaceful protests on social media. This is about an authoritarian government who will use violence and ultimately murder to suppress any dissent. And remember, many of these were children. And also, Saudi Arabia's executed more than 100 people just in these first 4 months of 2019. They are set to execute 300 more. Another case, which in fact our last Prime Minister, David Cameron, raised, is the case of a very young person who was only 17 when he was sentenced to crucifixion. He hasn't yet been executed, as far as we know. His name is Ali al-Namir, and he was sentenced to death for crucifixion for, he's accused of participating in an illegal demonstration and explaining how to give first aid to protesters and using his BlackBerry to invite his friends to join. Now, we as a democracy, as the mother of parliaments, as the, somebody who promulgates human rights, the British government, Theresa May, all the senior people in government and politics need to have a really long, hard look at themselves. Are they happy to call this barbaric regime an ally?
But we as an electorate, absolutely right. But world's electorate in the so-called West, we don't care anymore about what's outside of our doors. We're electing politicians who want to roll up the drawbridge, build walls, keep it all personal. Somebody said on Facebook, it's none of our business. That's the default position that's now considered policy in countries, even in this country, even in the United States. What we've got loose in the world. How old is MBS? He's 35? We've got a Nero loose in the world, all right? He's out there. And if we don't understand that this affects all of us and don't accept it, then he's going to carry on. He's a young guy. He'll be around here for the next 60 years.
That's part of the pressure that we're seeing here. Is there are internal forces in Saudi Arabia that have long been there, whether that's between the princes that are competing power centers in the succession race whenever a king is near death. We also have the traditional split between Sunni and Shia, with the Saudis being the custodians of the holy mosque on the Sunni side, and have always had a restive Shia minority. And we now have a more bellicose Iran that Saudi Arabia sees as their main threat. And then we have the United States that agrees that Iran is the main threat and sees Saudi Arabia as a useful ally there, despite what's happening in places like Yemen, despite what's happening domestically in Saudi Arabia. So I think there is a bit of internationalism in this ugly story.
Money. It's about money.
Yeah, but it's not the good internationalism.
Exactly.
It's the base necessity.
Let's just get the Saudi response, Arwa, because this is what we've received from them official statement on the execution. Saudi Arabia has long ago adopted a zero-tolerance policy towards terrorists. The convicted criminals who were executed today had their day in court and they were found guilty. They, like many countries, argue they have, an authoritative, independent judicial system, so we should be able to rely on it.
Look, that's the issue, Max. And then there's the issue, of course, of the legislation, the law that sort of surrounds the legal basis for which these arrests were carried out. And this anti-terrorism law is something that the United Nations has raised its concerns about, given just how loose and vague the language actually is. I mean, very basic activities can clearly in Saudi Arabia be tried under this law. One of the young men who was executed, who was just 17 years old at the time that this so-called crime was committed, was accused of throwing Molotov cocktails at the security forces, but then also of using his BlackBerry to rally people to the protest site. Now, his father, who was representing him in court, says, according to these court documents, my son is innocent. My son did not go to these demonstrations all that often. He just went to a couple of them, not more for 5 minutes at a time. He was a student, and he was actually arrested as he was getting ready to depart for the U.S. He was arrested at the airport, and in America, he was planning on enrolling in university. And his father also says that his son's confession was obtained under duress. He says the interrogator dictated the confession to his son and then forced him to sign it so that the torture would stop. But the bottom line, as we're hearing, from everyone in this discussion, is that Saudi Arabia knows that it can act with impunity. It has gotten away with so much worse than these 37 executions throughout the course of recent memory at this point.
This is Al Swekat, the guy that I was talking about. We've got an image of him. He was detained at an airport in Damon as he was preparing to board a plane to the United States, where he was set to enroll at Western Michigan University.
I mean, the stories are absolutely horrific. Another of the miners was accused of incitement via social media and preparing banners. I mean, can you think of the contrast between this country and Saudi Arabia? We have a society now where we're encouraging our young people to get involved in politics by social media. We're all going out on the streets with our placards. That would have your child executed here. He apparently was beaten and tortured with electricity and chained with his hands above his head until he confessed. Another one, Salman Quresh, was arrested shortly after his 18th birthday. So he was accused of crimes that took place when he was a minor. He was denied any legal rights. He was sentenced to death in a mass trial, so not even a specific trial about his case. And in fact, the United Nations intervened repeatedly on the lack of process. And
Just
in
to
fact,
point out, some of these aren't part of our reporting, but they're known
this is
cases.
information that I've had from, as I say, this charity sort of reprieve. But I think the stories are horrendous. And as the correspondent said, they've got away with far worse. They dismembered an American journalist. And the president of the United States basically gave the leader of Saudi Arabia a pass and said, I don't think he knew anything about it. The leader of America was asked, will you do anything to hold arms sales to Saudi Arabia? He said no. You're absolutely right. They are allowed to get away with this because leaders, I mean, I think it's even stronger with Donald Trump. Remember, the first international trip that Donald Trump made was to Saudi Arabia.
It's what the electorates... You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right. But we are electing people who are drawing up drawbridges and building walls.
Yeah.
That's happening in France. It's happening here. It's happening in the United States. That's what the electorate wants. So we can talk about this, and it's brilliant that CNN it keeps people conscious. But most people who I put money on it, who are watching this are going, well, what are we going to do about it? And it used to be that we did think we could do something about it. If people wanted to be in the so-called civilized world, there was a club you had to belong to, and that club had rules. And if you obeyed those rules, you could be in the club. If you didn't, you were ostracized. We don't believe in that club anymore. So we've got this Nero running loose in the world now, and he's going to keep on going.
Andrew, can I just, are we right to point the finger just at the United States when you look at
look at
top
United Kingdom.
exporters?
Yeah, look at this.
Look at
trading partners. It's China, Japan, interestingly,
Yeah.
India, South Korea come ahead of the United States.
And who do you think pioneered the defense of we don't interfere in your business, you don't interfere in us? That was China. That was China's line for years. And the world has spent
Japan's line, though, isn't it?
Japan, totally.
But the world has. Japan needs economic growth more than just about any other country. But it's not a new line that you stick to your knitting. We'll do what we want to do here, and that was the case when monks were lighting themselves on fire in China, or when protesters were being steamrollered by tanks in Tiananmen Square. You know, the Chinese have long had this position, and their influence in the world in places like Africa and places like Saudi Arabia, whether that's economic and now cultural, is done on a no-terms basis. It's that you can behave as poorly as you want as long as we get what we want, and you don't come lecture us about our rights.
There used to be a rhetoric. Now, it was rhetoric.
Yeah,
it was rhetoric.
It was ineffective with
but
China.
it was. But it used to be there. It used to be on the table, at least. It's not even on the table
let's look at
anymore.
things like the UN Human Rights Tribunal. That people like Saudi Arabia are on this is a joke. There are countries that are the worst human rights
the
abusers.
The UN
that
isn't
sit
a
on
joke.
this.
It's us who are the joke.
Well, I think
we
the
don't
human rights
believe.
part of it is
we
a
don't
joke.
believe in the UN anymore. Let's be honest about it. We don't believe in the World Court. We
Because they
don't
put Saudi
believe in
Arabia
it.
on the-
We don't believe in it.
But part of that is you're not going to educate the electorate, Bonnie, if you don't talk about it. And the electorate, to be honest, don't really care about anything. The studies show that people think about politics like for a minute, a week,
Exactly,
if that, because they're busy
exactly.
getting on with their lives. They're trying to get to work. They're trying to bring up their
Exactly.
kids, this, that, the next thing. So I think, yes, you can blame the electorate for everything, but our leaders also have to take responsibility. Our British Prime Minister has not, as far as I'm aware, and please correct me if I'm wrong, has not even... We rolled out the red carpet for Mohammed bin Salman.
We vote for ourselves. We elect who we are. And that's
we
who's
elect
there.
what was given to us.
But okay.
There are a a number of things to take into consideration just for a second there when it comes to how, say, Western leaders are willing to deal with China versus how they're dealing with Saudi Arabia. Look, yes, China absolutely brings countries on its side by providing very fast and easy loans with no strings attached. And because of that, to those same countries, nations like the United States won't offer those same string-free loans. But when it comes to, so it tries to hold a certain moral line when it comes to dealing with some countries, say in Africa, but yet it refuses to apply, America refuses to apply those same principles when it comes to a country like Saudi Arabia because of Saudi's dominance and its power. And unfortunately, we do need to, I think, sadly, accept that we live in a world with a broken moral compass where leaders and portions of populations are willing to give certain countries a free pass because everyone, at least too many people right now, are in this game of, well, I need to look out for myself. And it does feel as if there's sort of a shift in global consciousness that is not at this stage one for a better world.
And that's it.
We're going to be back in a moment. A couple of thoughts coming from our Facebook feed. Hasham says he lived there. Brutality is rooted in its culture. Leniency creates chaos. Dietrich says America looks the other way. And Mick says, we buy Saudi oil while Trump imposes sanctions on Iran. Why? What are your thoughts? Let us know.
Arwa can correct me if I'm wrong, but these protesters that were arrested, now executed, came after the Saudis executed a prominent Shia cleric a couple of years ago. Wasn't that the spark of all of these protests? I think that's another interesting level here.
Is that right, Arwa? Was this sparked by the attack on a Shia cleric?
Execution of a Shia cleric.
She's not hearing us.
She can't hear.
How can
Sorry,
they kill?
there's like a lot of traffic outside. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're just wondering what sparked
got
this
you back, I'm
latest. When we the targeting the protesters, was that sparked by a Shia cleric case a couple of years ago?
Execution of.
No, that's the case of the Iranian Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who was actually executed in 2006. Those who were executed that were part of this anti-government demonstrations case, these were demonstrations that took place in 2011 and 2012. And so they are all from the same area. Nimr al-Nimr is also from the same city where these anti-government demonstrations took place, but it wasn't necessarily in reaction to his execution. But clearly all of this is part and parcel and was part of a massive crackdown by the Saudi government against anyone who dares stand against this. And look, we've seen this before. We saw this in Syria.
Welcome back to CNN Talk. We're discussing a CNN exclusive on forced confessions that we've discovered in relation to a series of executions in Saudi Arabia. We're getting your response on that. And Stephen says, the hypocrisy of democratic nations stinks. Capitalism will turn a blind eye to any atrocity to make a buck, which is your line.
And always has been. And to take up Arwa's point, which is brilliant about the broken moral compass, the Congress of the United States, who has a constitutional duty of oversight of the executive, cannot even get a copy of the private text between Jared Kushner, the chief advisor to the President of the United States, and Mohammed bin Salman. Who knows what they're talking about and who knows what they're doing, but nobody cares. Nobody cares.
Let's hear from Donald Trump on the friendship with Saudi Arabia from November 2018.
This is about America first. They're paying us $400 billion plus to purchase and invest in our country. That's probably the biggest amount ever paid to the United States. We're not going to give up hundreds of billions of dollars in orders and let Russia, China, and everybody else have them. Saudi Arabia, if we broke with them, I think your oil prices would go through the roof.
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised about that. We watched that clip. I think we actually had a debate on this show about that. I mean, this conversation very much has echoes of the climate change discussion we had on Earth Day at the beginning of the week. And people were posing the question, what do you do once you get beyond the rhetoric about how terrible climate change? Will governments actually act? Will they sort of curb capitalism in order to stop climate change, will the pursuit of economic prosperity basically turn a blind eye to other things, whether it's climate change, whether it's human rights abuses? And I absolutely, I do agree with what Bonnie says very, very depressingly. I think the truth is, successive governments have always put the holy grail of economic prosperity above everything. And as long as we're getting our kind of cheap oil and our fancy, nice electric goods from China, we don't want to know about all of this stuff. The only thing I would say, just to add a bit of grit into the oyster, is that I think because we are so seized about how this moral compass, and that is a great expression, is lost now. I do think people are thinking a little bit more about it. I'm not saying that people are going to sort of, throw down, but, look at the protests we've had on climate change. Look, people, as they're educating, social media is also helping to educate people more about what's happening. And I think in our country, in the next general election, which is going to be very spicy for a lot of reasons, there's going to be a lot of big issues, not just the economy talked about. And I actually do think this issue about who are our allies, an ethical foreign policy, human rights, I do think, I'm not going to say it's going to be top of the agenda, but I think people will be talking more about it.
Sorry, Arwa, you also reported on Khashoggi, and that's the case that really internationalised that, the knowledge around Saudi Arabia as well. How does that case tie in with your latest reporting around these documents?
Well, I actually did want to bring up a point about that, because when we looked at what happened post the Jamal Khashoggi hair-raising, brutal murder, there was something of a reaction from international players and from governments. And when Saudi had their big economic forum shortly afterwards, people sent second-tier representatives, although they didn't pull out completely. But now it seems that the waters calmed after the Khashoggi story. They realized that there weren't going to be any sort of severe repercussions for the Saudi government, that doing business with Saudi Arabia was still going to be okay. And so the day after these 37 executions took place, another big conference and several big banking and finance names were there. I mean, look, BlackRock CEO, HSBC CEO, JP Morgan's chief operating officer were at that conference, were on stage. They weren't even asked about Saudi Arabia's human rights violations. So while on the one hand, yes, governments are responsible, but so are big businesses and big money.
These are images, Andrew, from that conference after the executions. It looks like a regular day in Riyadh.
Yeah, and this is really, I think, where when you're linking climate change with something like this, it's very interesting, because we in Canada for years tried to push that Canada is a big oil producer with the oil sands that have faced a lot of environmental protests, but we try to position ourselves as the ethical oil producers in your neighborhood. Would you rather buy oil from Canada, who's a democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and all that, or do you want to buy it from places like Venezuela? Do you want to buy it places from Saudi Arabia? And we got nowhere, and I remember being in Copenhagen for the climate summit in 2009, and the amount of protesters we got as Canada, nobody's talking about Saudi Arabia or China, or let alone protesting in those countries, because you can't. And a lot of that debate got shifted onto mature, responsible democracies who could help in the short term bridge that gap to a non-carbon future without having to deal with these regimes. But we can't get that conversation started, let alone keep people away from money and opportunity.
We gave the Saudi response earlier. They have their defense. I just want to point this out as well. This comes from Amnesty. When we talk about the number of executions in the world, actually China is, we don't have exact figures, way out in front. And actually Iran is ahead of Saudi Arabia. So we shouldn't pin all of these accusations on Saudi Arabia alone.
No, not at all, if we're going to do statistics. But, we're talking about barbarity. We're talking about a country that appears to be civilized and wants us to think it is, that suddenly does these kinds of things. I am an optimist about human nature. I think we're going to sort this, but we can't do it unless we tell the truth about ourselves. And the truth is everything we've been saying at this table. We're at a moment where we don't give up, whatever.
Arwa?
I was just going to add to that to say, sure, Saudi Arabia may not be at the top of the list of those carrying out these types of executions, but that doesn't necessarily exonerate them. And Western countries don't have the same kind of relations with Saudi Arabia that they have with Iran, for example. And then just to throw this in there, too, while we're talking about U.S. sanctions against Iran, the Americans are expecting Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has come forward and said, we're going to fill that gap that removing Iranian oil from the markets might create. And people who purchase from Iran can go purchase from Saudi Arabia, or we'll find you other markets. And so there's such this dark underbelly to these relationships that exist that the more you dig away at it, the more questionable it actually all becomes. And yes, Saudi is what we're talking about right now, but this is a problem that goes far beyond just the case of these 37 men who were horribly executed. This goes to the very core of how we've built these various different relationships, how our societies function, how money actually moves the world as opposed to morality or humanity.
It's the bottom line.
And I think we only change things by talking about it.
Saudi has oil, so it can do as it likes, says Lynn. Nell says the world looks away. It's all about money. Money very much dominating the conversation on our Facebook feed. You can contribute there for the next hours and days if you want to get involved. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Arwa, as well, for joining us with your excellent reporting as ever.
Okay.